Did Jesus ever poop? That might sound like one of the most irrelevant questions to ask of one of the most significant and important historical figures of all time. But this question may not be as ridiculous as it sounds. Christians in the early 2nd century seriously debated this question in an attempt to either prove or disprove a major Christological mystery called Docetism. To debate the merits of Docetism, all you really need to do is ask yourself this very basic question. Did Jesus have a real human body? Docetic Christians claimed that the answer to this question is no. For many Christians and even non-Christians today, the answer to this question seems rather obvious. If the historical Jesus really did exist, then he must have had a real human body and did real human things, like eat, sleep, breathe, and even poop. But to ancient Christians, especially in the early 2nd century Gnostic movement, the answer to whether or not Jesus had a real human body was not so straightforward. In the 1st century, in the years immediately following his death, Jesus was increasingly seen as more and more divine. In other words, as time went on, the divine nature of Jesus was more and more emphasized. And you don't have to take my word for it. Read the Gospels in the order in which they were written and see for yourself. How divine does Jesus appear in Mark, the first Gospel to be written, compared to Jesus in John, the last Gospel to be written? In Mark, Jesus seems more human, or at least his humanness is more emphasized. In John, Jesus is clearly divine. So how were early 2nd century Christians supposed to understand the nature of Christ? Was he human? Was he God? Was he a demigod, like Hercules? Remember, this is before the doctrine of the Trinity was fully fleshed out, and before the Trinitarian view of God was officially recognized as orthodox. It's possible that some early 2nd century Christians had what I would call a proto-Trinitarian view of God, but that is merely conjecture on my part. Considering the first written record of someone using the term Trinity for God comes from Theophilus of Antioch in the late 2nd century CE. And really, even Theophilus of Antioch didn't use the word Trinity the same way post-Council of Nicaea Christians would in the mid-4th century. All of that is to say that early 2nd century Christians debated the nature of Jesus a lot. And there were a number of different perspectives and opinions. Docetism claimed that Jesus really did not have a human body. The word docetic comes from the Greek word dokeo, which means to seem or to appear. Docetic Christians believed that Jesus seemed to have a body, but it was only an illusion, like a telegraphic projection or a phantom. It was visible, but made completely of supernatural substance. The Docetics would have completely disagreed with the Trinitarian or the post-Nicene understanding that Jesus was 100% man and 100% God all at the same time. And really, this is kind of an oxymoron. To say that Jesus is 100% God and 100% man is kind of like saying you have a pointy circle or a round square. It just can't happen. To be God means you have no limitations. To be a human means you have limitations. How can you be unlimited and limited at the same time? So if Jesus came to earth and appeared to be a human, how do you explain things like the pain he felt on the cross or the tears he cried for Lazarus? For the Docetics, the answer to this question is easy. The pain Jesus felt and the tears he cried were only apparent. They were part of the illusion, so to speak. This all seemed good and well for the Docetic Christians, but they didn't get off that easy. They faced a flurry of questions from people who disagreed with their way of thinking. And this makes sense, because if you read all 4 Gospels with a Docetic theology, you will eventually run up on some passages of Scripture that don't quite fit. Like, how could a phantom be touched? We know from the Bible that people touched Jesus, like in the Synoptic Gospels when a woman who suffered from a bleeding problem touched Jesus' garment and was healed. Or when Jesus carried his cross, or when he was beaten, or when he was nailed to the cross. People clearly touched him in all of those instances. So how do you explain that from a Docetic standpoint? Also, what about when Jesus ate? How does a phantom just appear to eat food? That would require that not only Jesus was a phantom or a hologram, but that the food was also. We know Jesus, at the very least, ate bread, like at the Last Supper. So how does a body that's not really a body eat or drink? And yes, these are the questions that early Christians were asking. And if you're going to be debating about whether or not Jesus had a real body and about whether or not he ate or drank, then the next logical thing to ask is, how does a body that's not really a body eliminate its waste? And here is where we get the earliest and very serious discussion as to whether or not Jesus ever pooped. An early 2nd century Egyptian Christian named Valentinus is arguably one of the most significant Christian thinkers of the early Christian movement. Seen as a heretic by the early church fathers, Valentinus was responsible for ushering in the Valentinian school of Christian thought, which eventually became called Valentinianism, which is now seen as a type of ancient Gnosticism. Valentinus himself was not a docetic, and as a matter of fact, he engaged in a lot of anti-docetic arguments. But I want you to listen to what he says as recorded by Clement of Alexandria. Valentinus believed that Jesus was a real human being with a real human body with real human needs like eating and drinking. But listen to what he says next. Jesus was continent. Continent meaning being able to control your bladder and bowels. So Jesus was continent, enduring all things. Jesus digested divinity. He ate and drank in a special way, without excreting his solids. He had such a great capacity for continence that the nourishment within him was not corrupted, for he did not experience corruption. So here, Valentinus is agreeing with the other docetic Christians that Jesus never pooped, but they disagree on why they think this. The Docetics believed that Jesus never pooped because he didn't have a real human body. Valentinus believed Jesus never pooped because he had such a great capacity for continence that the nourishment within him was not corrupted. In other words, Jesus was so holy that there was no part of the nourishment within the food he ate that went to waste. Everything he ate was used up. Therefore, he would have no waste. Pretty interesting theory, but what does all of this teach us? Well, it shows us that the concept that Jesus never pooped was not just a belief that the Docetics had, but it was also a belief that many different Christians had in the ancient world. And it shows us that this rather odd question had a huge impact on the theological development of Christology. Now, obviously, I did not mention everything about Docetism or about Docetic Christian arguments. And as a matter of fact, you could probably have hundreds of hours of video content just talking about Docetism. It was that widespread of a belief in the ancient world, talked about all the time by the church fathers. But I hope this video was a fun way to introduce this fascinating early Christian belief. I think it's time now for a bonus fact. Did you know butterflies never poop? Like ever? They use all their food as energy. Caterpillars, on the other hand, are almost continuously eating and pooping all throughout the day. So much so that there is a special name for caterpillar poop. It's called frass. And if you get enough caterpillars together, you can actually hear them pooping. Well, consider hitting that like button if you thought this was a solid video. That could have been a bad choice of words. Stay thirsty for knowledge.